Vivid verses.
The first thing I noticed was the mug. Naomi had started making her coffee in the blue one. The one with the hairline crack near the handle that I'd always used, the one she used to tease me about. You'll cut your lip on that thing eventually. She'd never touched it in 4 years. Then one Tuesday, I came downstairs and it was in the drying rack, and she was telling someone on the phone, laughing, "No, it's this ugly blue mug. I don't know why I like it now." And I understood in the specific, unhurried way I understand most things that she wasn't talking about the mug. I didn't say anything. I made my coffee in the other one. Over the following weeks, I started keeping a private ledger. Not written down anywhere, just filed away. I file everything, problems I intend to solve eventually, sorted by cost of delay. The Sunday crossword, which she'd always done alone at the kitchen table while I made eggs, now happened on video calls with Dara from her office. The two of them arguing over 7-letter words while my eggs went cold on the counter because she'd stopped waiting for them. The nickname she'd given me in our second year, Captain, because I overplanned everything, because I'd once printed a laminated itinerary for a weekend in the lakes, surfaced in a text I saw lit up on her phone, addressed to someone else. "Tell Captain I said hi," Dara had written, and Naomi had sent back a laughing emoji, and I understood that the joke had been exported, repackaged, handed to a man who had done nothing to earn it except exist in the right chair at the right time. None of this, on its own, would have told me anything. People borrow each other's habits without meaning to. Offices absorb the personalities of the people in them. A joke can travel without carrying its history along. I know this. I'm not a man who builds a case out of a mug and a crossword. But I'm also not a man who ignores a pattern once it's shown itself twice. So I watched the way I'd watch a system I didn't trust, not for confirmation because I already had enough of that, but for shape. I want to know how far along it was. I want to know if this was something happening to me or something that had already happened, and I was only now being informed. It had already happened. That much became clear within a month. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say she was replacing me, because it's not the obvious thing. It wasn't an affair, not in the way people mean when they say that word. I never found messages that cross a line I could point to, never caught them in a hotel lobby, never had the clean, brutal evidence that ends a marriage in a single afternoon. If it had been that, I think I would have known what to do with it. Betrayal with a shape is easy. You can hold it, turn it over, decide what it costs. What she was doing was slower and, I came to think, more deliberate than an affair would have been. She was disassembling the specific architecture of us, the private references, the domestic rhythms, the small daily proofs that we were a unit distinct from every other unit, and rebuilding that architecture around someone else, piece by piece, while I was still living inside the original structure. She wasn't leaving me. She was replacing me in place, the way you'd swap a part in a machine that's still running so that by the time the machine stopped, no one would notice the moment it happened. I don't say this with any heat. I want to be clear about that too. I didn't spend those weeks angry. Anger is a response to injustice, and I hadn't yet decided this was an injustice. I decided it was a fact, and facts require a different kind of attention than grievances do. Grievances want an audience. Fact want a response. I also didn't plead. I want to be honest about the fact that the thought never seriously occurred to me. Not I decided not to beg, as if it were a temptation I resisted, but that the option didn't register as an option at all. Pleading assumes the other person doesn't know what they're doing, that if you illuminate the situation clearly enough, they'll be moved to reconsider. But Naomi knew exactly what she was doing. She'd have to. You don't accidentally hand your husband's nickname to another man. You don't accidentally start drinking his coffee out of his mug. 6 months of small, precise transfers isn't an accident. It's a project. And you don't plead with someone in the middle of a project. You let them finish it, or you finish it for them. I chose to finish it for her, just not in the way she expected. Here is what I didn't do in the early weeks, because I think the absence of it matters as much as what came after. I didn't confront her. I didn't sit her down at the kitchen table, the one where she and Dara did the crossword now, and lay out the mug, the nickname, the Sunday calls, and ask her to explain herself. I turned this over exactly once, mentally, as a possible course of action, and rejected it within about 30 seconds, for reasons that had less to do with pride than with strategy. A confrontation hands the other person the floor. It says, "Here's my case, please respond to it." And whatever she said in response, an apology, a denial, a counter-accusation about my own failures as a husband, a tearful confession that led to a tearful reconciliation, would have put the outcome back in her hands. She would have gotten to manage the ending. She'd have gotten to be sorry or wronged or complicated, and I would have had to receive whatever she decided to give me. I didn't want to receive anything from her anymore. That was the actual decision. If I'm tracing it back to its root, not I want to punish her or I want to win, but I am done being the party who waits to find out what happens to him. So instead, I did something that I think surprised her more than confrontation would have. I got quiet and I got busy. The first thing I did was financial, because financial things are the easiest to make irreversible without announcing yourself. We had a joint account we used for the mortgage and the bills, and a habit, mine originally adopted by both of us, of overpaying the mortgage by a fixed amount every month, chasing an early payoff date we'd set together in our first year in the house, back when that kind of long-view planning felt like a shared value instead of a solitary compulsion. I've been the one managing it. I knew exactly where we stood, what the payoff date currently was, how much slack existed in the monthly budget if the overpayment stopped. I didn't stop them. I want to be clear about that, because stopping them would have been a kind of message, a small act of sabotage disguised as prudence. And I wasn't interested in sabotage. What I did instead was separate my own finances from hers with a thoroughness that had nothing punitive in it and everything logistical. I opened an account in my name only. I redirected my salary there. I kept contributing my half to the joint account, exactly as before, exactly on time, so that nothing about our shared obligations would visibly change. But everything beyond the shared obligations, my savings, my bonus, the freelance work I did on the side, I quietly moved into a structure that existed entirely outside our marriage. This took about 3 weeks, done in small increments, an hour here and there after she'd gone to bed or while she was on one of her calls with Dara. I told her none of it. There was nothing to tell yet. I wasn't hiding a decision from her. I was simply not volunteering information about a process that hadn't concluded. The second thing I did was about the house itself. We'd talked, vaguely, over the years about renovating the spare room. Turning it from the junk room it had become into something usable, an office, maybe for whichever of us needed it more. I'd always been the one who wanted this. Naomi had always been the one who said someday, who let the conversation drift because the room worked fine as storage and neither of us needed an office urgently enough to deal with the contractors. I dealt with the contractors. I did it during the day while she was at work, at the office where Dara sat 2 desks away, where the Sunday crossword now got its rehearsal calls, and I had it framed, wired, painted, and furnished within 5 weeks. When she came home to find it finished, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the desk, the shelving, the reading chair I'd moved in from the living room, and she asked, in a tone I recognized as suspicion, trying to sound like curiosity, why I'd finally done it. Needed a project, I said, which was true in the sense that everything I said to her during this period was true, carefully true in a way that gave her nothing to hold. I didn't tell her that the desk in that room was mine now. I'd started sleeping there some nights when I said I was working late on something, that I was functionally already living in a version of the house that had 1 fewer shared space than it used to. She didn't ask the follow-up questions that might have gotten her closer to that. I think she didn't want to ask them. I think by then she'd have preferred not to know what I was doing, because not knowing let her keep believing she was still the one in control of the timeline. I should say something here about Dara, because it would be dishonest to write around him as if he were incidental. I never disliked him, exactly in the sense of a personal animus. I'd met him twice at office things Naomi had brought me to before all this started, and he'd struck me as unremarkable in the specific way that made him dangerous. Easy, undemanding, the kind of man who laughs at things before they're fully funny because he wants you to feel that you're funny. I understood, watching him those 2 times, exactly what function he was going to serve for someone like Naomi, who has always needed to feel like the most interesting person in a room and who had, over our years together, started to experience my particular flavor of steadiness as a kind of quiet accusation. I don't plan every weekend because I distrust her judgment. I do it because it's how my mind organizes itself. But I understood, eventually, that she'd stopped experiencing it that way, that my steadiness had curdled for her into something she needed a reprieve from, and Dara was the reprieve. I never once considered trying to outcompete him for that role. It would have meant becoming a different kind of man than the one I am, performing an ease I don't naturally have, and even if I could have managed it for a while, I don't think I'd have wanted the marriage that resulted. One held together by my successful impersonation of someone else's colleague. If that was what she needed, she already had it. There is no version of this where I improve my position by trying to be more like Dara. There is only a version where I stopped being available for comparison at all. So I didn't compete. I don't think I even watched him closely past the first few weeks of establishing that the pattern was real. Once I understood what he was, not a villain, just a vacancy she'd chosen to fill, he stopped being relevant to what I was doing. The project was never about him. It was about the exit, and exits don't require you to study the person walking in as you walk out. By the 3rd month, the shape of my life had changed in ways she hadn't fully priced in because she wasn't looking for them. She was looking for the things a wounded husband does, the confrontation that didn't come, the jealousy that didn't come, the withdrawal into visible misery that didn't come. What she got instead was a man who seemed, if anything, to be doing better, sleeping fine, working out again after a 2-year hiatus, finishing a woodworking project he'd abandoned in the garage the year before, occasionally going out on a Thursday night without explaining where. I watched this register on her in small ways. She started asking more questions than she used to. Not accusatory ones, just probing, the kind of question a person asks when they're trying to locate a threat they can't quite see. "You've been busy lately. Everything okay?" I told her everything was fine, which was again true. I had never been less confused about anything in my life. I think what unsettled her wasn't that I'd found someone else. I hadn't, and I don't believe she suspected I had. What unsettled her was that I'd stopped needing an explanation from her. She'd built this whole quiet architecture of transition, months of careful, deniable work, presumably because some part of her wanted the ending to happen a particular way. Gently, over time, with enough plausible deniability that when she finally said the words, I'd already be half prepared, and my grief would be manageable, contained, something she could witness with sympathy rather than guilt. She wanted, I think, to be able to tell herself, and possibly Dara, and possibly her friends afterward that she hadn't blindsided me, that I'd seen it coming, that in some sense I'd let her go. What she hadn't accounted for was that I might see it coming faster than her plan required, and respond by finishing the transition on my own terms before she'd finished orchestrating hers. There's a particular moment I keep returning to from partway through the 4th month that I think crystallizes something about the whole arrangement. Naomi's sister was getting married in the autumn, out of town, a whole weekend affair with a rehearsal dinner and a Sunday brunch, the kind of event we'd have discussed in detail 6 months earlier. What to wear when a drive up, whether to extend it into a short holiday afterward. This time, she mentioned it to me almost in passing, over dinner, in a tone carefully calibrated to sound casual. I was thinking I might just go up Friday morning instead of Thursday night. Simplify things. I understood immediately what this meant. Thursday night was when I'd normally have come to, taken the time off work, made it a proper weekend for both of us. Friday morning, alone, was a plan built around my absence, around not having to manage the choreography of me being there while some other unspoken arrangement with Dara happened around the edges of it. Text during the reception, maybe, or a conversation about him that she wanted to be free to have without me in the room. Sound good, I said. I've got some things to catch up on anyway. She looked up at that, a flicker of something, surprise maybe, or the first real unease I'd seen from her in the whole 4 months. I think she'd expected, even now, that I'd push back a little, ask why we weren't going together, make her either lie more elaborately or tell some partial truth. Instead, I'd simply agreed, cleanly, with no visible cost to me. What she didn't know was that I'd already, 2 weeks earlier, told my own family I likely wouldn't be attending her sister's wedding depending on how things go, a phrase I'd used deliberately, laying groundwork with people who'd eventually need context, without giving them the context yet. I wasn't preparing to be devastated by her going alone. I was preparing for a version of the future where we weren't attending family events together at all, and I'd started, quietly, negotiating my own re-entry into that future ahead of her. Somewhere around the 5th month, I made the decision that mattered most, the one that everything else had been building toward without my having named it as a destination until I reached it. I was going to be the one who ended the marriage. Not out of any wish to control the story, or not only that, but because I understood, with the clarity that comes to me on the far side of a long analytical process, that if I let her be the one to say the words, I would spend the rest of my life carrying the shape she gave the ending. She constructed narrative. We grew apart. It was mutual, really. He was a good man, but we just weren't compatible anymore. And I would either have to accept that narrative or spend years litigating against it in rooms full of people who'd already decided to believe her because she'd get to tell it first, and first tellings calcify. I wasn't going to give her that. So I stopped preparing quietly for an ending she'd deliver, and started preparing quietly to deliver one myself, on a timeline of my choosing, built around facts she hadn't yet finished arranging, so that when it happened, there would be nothing left of the elaborate soft landing she'd spent half a year constructing. I found a place, a small flat, 15 minutes from the house, unfurnished, available on short notice, and signed a 6-month lease under my own name, paid from the account she didn't know existed. I told no one. I moved almost nothing into it at first. A bed, a kettle, a chair. I went there some evenings, ostensibly for the woodworking thing, which had by then become a real enough hobby that the lie required almost no maintenance. I spoke to a solicitor. Not urgently, not dramatically, one measured, unemotional consultation, in which I described the situation with the same flat precision I'm using here, and asked what my position would be, practically, if I initiated a separation on my own terms versus waiting for her to initiate one on hers. The advice was straightforward. Initiating cleanly, with my affairs already in order, would leave less room for the process to be dragged out or complicated later. I left that meeting with a checklist. I completed the checklist over the following 6 weeks. I want to note, because it matters to the honesty of this account, that at no point during any of this did I feel the urge to tell anyone what I was doing in order to be reassured that I was doing the right thing. I didn't call my brother and describe the mug and the nickname and ask him if I was crazy. I didn't need anyone to confirm that my reading of the situation was correct, or to tell me I deserved better, or to validate the plan before I executed it. The plan didn't require an audience. It only required to be finished. She came to me on a Tuesday evening in the 6th month, and I understood the moment she asked if we could talk that this was the conversation she'd been building toward the entire time. The one she'd rehearsed probably many times in the car on the way home from lunches with Dara, in the shower, in the quiet minutes before sleep. I could see the shape of it in the way she sat down across from me instead of beside me, in the water she poured for herself first. Unprompted, a small stalling gesture. She had a script. I could see it sitting behind her eyes, waiting for its cue. "I think we need to talk about where we are," she said. "As a couple. I've been feeling for a while like we've drifted. Like we want different things now. I don't think this is anyone's fault. I just think we've grown into different people." I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't supply the word she was reaching for, didn't do any of the things that would have made this easier for her by turning it into a dialogue instead of a monologue she needed to deliver in full before she could feel she'd been honest. "I agree," I said when she was done. "I felt it too. I've actually already started sorting some things out." She blinked. This wasn't the response the script had prepared her for. The script, I imagine, had a version of me who was hurt but understanding, who needed to be walked gently toward acceptance, who might cry a little, who would ask, "Is there someone else?" and receive a careful, half-honest answer designed to protect both her and Dara from the full truth while still, eventually, letting the truth surface on her schedule, with her narration attached. "What do you mean, sorted things out?" "I've got a place. I've been staying there some nights already when I said I was working on the woodworking stuff. I spoke to a solicitor about 6 weeks ago. I think the cleanest thing is if I move the rest of my things out this weekend, and we let the lawyers handle the rest from there." I watched something happen to her face that I hadn't anticipated feeling anything about, and did anyway, at a distance, the way you feel something about weather in a country you don't live in, a kind of remote, observational interest rather than an emotion of my own. She looked, for a moment, like someone who'd walked confidently into a room expecting resistance and found it empty. She opened her mouth, and I think what came out wasn't what she'd planned to say at all, because it came out too fast, too unguarded. "You already have a place?" "For about 6 weeks. You didn't say anything." There wasn't anything to say until there was something to say. I didn't want to have this conversation with you until I was actually ready to have it. Now I am. She sat very still for a moment. I watched her run through what I can only describe as a rapid inventory of her own preparedness, checking, I think, whether any part of her rehearsed script still applied to the room she was actually sitting in, and finding that almost none of it did. She'd prepared for a man who needed managing. She'd gotten a man who'd already managed himself out the door. I thought we'd at least talk about it, try things, or at least figure out together what this actually means. "We can talk about logistics," I said. "The house, the accounts, whatever needs sorting. I'm not trying to make this ugly, but I don't think there's a version of trying things here that either of us actually wants. You've been building an exit for months. I've just been building mine a little faster." I watched that land. I want to describe it accurately rather than dramatically. She didn't cry. Not then, not in front of me. Her face did something controlled and small, a kind of recalibration, the look of someone doing quick arithmetic on a story they'd assumed had more time left to run. She asked, after a silence I didn't rush to fill, how I knew. Not what I knew, notably, but how, which told me something about what she still imagined was salvageable, some hope that if the mechanism of discovery had been narrow enough, the rest of it might still be negotiable. "The mug," I said. "And after that, everything else." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to give her the whole ledger. The nickname, the crossword, the Sunday calls, the sister's wedding, 6 months of small transfers she'd probably told herself were harmless or private, or none of my business until she decided otherwise. Naming all of it would have turned this into the confrontation I'd spent 6 months deliberately avoiding, and I still didn't want that. I wanted her to understand that I'd seen it, that this wasn't a surprise she was springing on an unsuspecting man, without giving her the satisfaction of a scene, without giving her anything to apologize into. An apology needs a wound presented for inspection. I wasn't presenting mine. She tried, over the following days, to find her way back into some version of control over how this would go. She suggested counseling, which I declined, not coldly, but simply on the grounds that counseling exists to save something both parties want saved, and I didn't think that description applied to us anymore. And I suspected, underneath her offer, she didn't fully think so either, that the offer was itself a kind of performance, evidence she could point to later that she'd tried. She asked once whether I was seeing someone in a tone that wanted the answer to be yes. I think because a yes would have let her recast the whole 6 months as something mutual, two people quietly moving toward other people at the same time, a wash. I told her no, truthfully, and watched that land less comfortably than a yes would have. She asked, another time, whether this meant I hated her. I told her I didn't, which was also true. Hatred requires a kind of ongoing investment I no longer had the appetite for. What I felt, if I'm naming it precisely, was closer to a low, settled clarity, the feeling of having correctly diagnosed a problem and then correctly executed the fix with the added, almost incidental satisfaction of having done it without becoming a person I didn't recognize in the process. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't groveled. I hadn't performed devastation for her benefit or anyone else's. I had noticed, decided, and acted in that order at my own pace, and the marriage had ended roughly on schedule with my noticing rather than hers. I moved my things out that weekend, as I'd said I would. It took 4 hours, most of it spent on books and clothes, since the flat was already furnished with the essentials I'd need. Naomi watched from the kitchen doorway for part of it, arms crossed, and didn't offer to help, and I didn't ask her to. At one point she said, quietly, almost to herself, I thought I'd have more time to figure out how to tell you. You had time, I said. You used it for something else. She didn't answer that. I didn't need her to. I think about Dara sometimes, not often, and without any particular weight attached to the thought. I don't know, and haven't asked, whether he and Naomi are together now in a way that would have made all of this legible as a straightforward affair, or whether the whole architecture she built around him will, in the absence of my presence to build it against, simply lose its purpose and dissolve. It isn't my project to track anymore. I built one exit. I don't need to audit the one she's still working on. I kept the woodworking. I kept the reading chair, which came with me to the flat, and the crossword habit, oddly, which I picked back up alone on Sunday mornings, not because I missed doing it with her, but because I discovered in the process of losing several small rituals at once, which ones had actually belonged to me, and which ones had only ever belonged to us on loan, the way you loan out a jacket you expect to get back. The crossword, it turned out, was mine. I'd simply let it become collective for a while. The mortgage overpayment stopped, eventually, once the house was sold and the accounts settled, cleanly, without dispute, because there'd been nothing left to dispute by the time the conversation happened. My solicitor told me, near the end of it, that it was one of the more straightforward separations she'd handled in years, and I understood that this was, in its own quiet way, the actual outcome I'd been building toward the whole time. Not victory, not vindication, just an absence of mess, purchased in advance, months before anyone else knew there was a mess to prevent. I don't know what Naomi tells people now, when the subject comes up, whether she's found a way to narrate this as mutual, as growth, as two people who simply wanted different things. I've heard, secondhand, a version that leans that way, and I let it stand uncorrected because correcting it would require an argument I have no further use for. She can have the story. She built one for months before I ever knew there was a story being built. I only insisted, in the end, on writing the last chapter myself before she got the chance to write it for both of us. That was the part she hadn't planned for. Not that I'd found out, and not even that I'd leave. I think some part of her had always assumed I might eventually leave, once the mug and the nickname and the rest of it became too obvious to ignore. What she hadn't planned for was that I'd leave first on my own terms, having already built somewhere to go, having already spoken to the lawyer, having already turned the spare room into an office I never once let her use. That by the time she sat down across from me with her rehearsed opening line, there would be nothing left in the room for her carefully prepared ending to attach itself to. She'd spent 6 months preparing to let me go gently. I'd spent 5 preparing to already be gone.
Thanks for listening.